To introduce today's next awardee or team of awardees, I think what attracts people to aquatic sciences varies with circumstance and personality and that, but it turns out for me, one of the things I've ended up loving about being an aquatic scientist was to work with people that I really admire and like. And I didn't realize this when I started. I did a master's program and it was a miserable experience and I just about ready to quit. And then I ended up starting a PhD in the early 1980s in Steve Carpenter's lab, as many of the ideas that we're going to hear about here started to coalesce. Steve put together a workshop, I can remember, on where he rolled out a lot of the ideas that he and Jim Kitchell and Jim Hodgson had been working on in what we would now call a synthesis group or a working group, and it ended up as a book, and then eventually in the paper that we honor today. As a student, I didn't appreciate how hard it is to make very complicated thinking simple. That's probably the biggest gift Steve's given to us, is clarity of vision in science and his ability to see through the mess to the core of the issue. I think this paper is particularly influential in that way because on retrospect, you look back and go, it's so simple. How did, it's obvious. It wasn't obvious at the time, though. In fact, Mike Vanny, who nominated the award, pointed out that it was highly controversial. There was the top-down, bottom-up debates, and these were vigorous, would be a nice way of saying it. And yet the paper has had its legs. It's continued to contribute to science all the way through. And Mike Vanny also points out that there's a cascading effect, and he says, pun intended, that 100 of the papers that cited this paper have themselves been cited 100 times. That's an incredible multiplier, and the paper still continues to be cited at rates well above what the integral of my career would be. So it really is an amazing contribution to science, and so today's John Martin Award is given to the team of Stephen Carpenter, Jim Kitchell, and Jim Hodgson for the Trophic Cascade paper. Steve?
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks to all of you for coming. The talk that I'm going to give this morning is mostly about saying thank you to my nominators, to the committee, to ASLO for its promotion of aquatic sciences worldwide, and to many people who were involved in the development of the Trophic Cascade project over the years. So the paper is shown here, and I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the background of the paper and a little bit about where the ideas have gone over time. This small object that's inset into the paper is called a typewriter, and I believe that this will be the last John Martin Award-winning paper to be produced on a typewriter. Those of the younger people in the room may not be familiar with this thing, but it performs functions similar to a computer. There's no mouse and there's no screen, and you actually see the words appear on the paper as you strike the keys. About the only thing you would recognize about it is the pattern of letters on the keys, which has been unchanged for about 150 years. But in any case, this is how the paper was produced. Another point I want to make about the paper is known to a few people who teach this concept, but maybe not as widely known as it should be. And the paper contains a pictorial pun. The drawings in the paper were done, by the way, on parchment paper with Indian ink. They were not done on a computer. So this is a paper from a different era. But the pictorial pun has to do with the fish shapes that appear in these graphs. So the graphs show the effect on biomasses of contrasting perturbations to a food web, and the point is that fish effects occur all through the ecosystem, from piscivore biomass all the way down to primary production, which of course was one of the points of the paper, and this graph actually embeds that point in it. The follow-on to that paper was a series of whole lake experiments that went on for about 15 years. I particularly want to thank my co-authors of the paper, Jim Kitchell and Jim Hodgson, who are seen in the upper left photograph processing bass that were involved in the experiment. The first fish manipulation took us about 10 days of very hard work and a number of surprises along the way, and we celebrated with champagne that had been incubated in the hypolimnion of Peter Lake. In the upper right, you see Jim holding one of those bottles. Jim Hodgson is on the far left of that illustration. I also want to point out Jim Elser, president of ASLO, who was working on the project at the time. You see him here confronting a millipore filter apparatus, and that's Jim and his wife Monica processing samples on the dike between Paul and Peter Lake. Those experiments led to a paper in ecology, which is shown on the lower right, which is the experimental follow-on to the BioScience paper. Jim Klern told us the importance of rejection and some interesting stories about rejected papers. This Cascade data paper was rejected by Science magazine, and as I recall, it was rejected with extreme prejudice because it was completely unreasonable to think that fish could affect primary production, and we were obviously nuts. But it was eventually published, and I'll leave it to Jim Elser to tell his own story about his Lindemann Award-winning paper on stoichiometry and the role of zooplankton in actually changing the pelagic stoichiometry of experimental lakes. But it was a similar sort of reaction that everybody knows animals don't affect biogeochemistry. It's the other way around. But Jim persevered and was recognized for that contribution. These early experiments led to many more experiments. We kept probing different aspects of the trophic cascade, and generations of students and postdocs worked on the project. If you want to hear about the latest things going on in the trophic cascade project, Mike Pace is giving a talk on Friday morning, and I recommend that you go hear what he has to say. And there have been too many people involved in this project for me to thank them by name in the time available. Many of them are pictured here, but not all. There were a number of people I couldn't find pictures of, but I want to extend thanks to all of them. We published a synthesis paper in 2001 that brought together the explanation of how nutrient and food web effects could work in tandem. How do they operate jointly? How do food web effects ultimately explain the variance in primary production that is not explained by phosphorus? And so the goal of that paper was to integrate all the findings and explain how everything works together. I also want to acknowledge an inanimate object, which is the cabin, this cabin is on a hill overlooking Tenderfoot Lake near the experimental lake site. This is the view from the porch of the cabin. All of our grant proposals and our papers were conceived and written in this cabin, and I think it really shows the importance of place in ecosystem science. Ecosystem science is place-based research, and a group of people getting together, friends getting together and struggling together to understand their results is how ecosystem science gets done. And this cabin above Tenderfoot Lake was very important to that project. Unfortunately, due to a series of administrative processes that I won't go into today, the cabin no longer exists. Feel free to ask me or Mike Pace or Jim Kitchell if you want to know more about that. But it played a really important role in the trophic cascade. So how's the idea done? This plot shows publications per year that employ the phrase trophic cascade from 1974 to 2015. The phrase, as far as I know, was first used by Robert Payne in a 1980 paper on the Rocky Intertidal. Of course, the general idea of food web effects on ecosystem processes actually turns out to be very old. There are allusions in Darwin, in the Italian scientist Camerano's writing. It's an idea that's decades old, but Payne was the first to use the phrase. You can see our 1985 paper, the one that's being honored today, and then an increase in use of the concept up to more than 200 papers per year nowadays that employ the phrase. The current citation rate is about 15 times higher, more than 3,000 times per year. So it's somehow gone viral. In the early 90s, there was a famous paper by Don Strong entitled "Are Trophic Cascades All Wet?" which pointed out that food web effects on primary production could only occur in aquatic systems. They couldn't possibly occur on land. Mike Pace led a review paper in Tree in 1999, which opened with a quote from Aldo Leopold about wolves and deer, and Mike's paper pointed out that, hey, wait a minute, there's plenty of evidence in terrestrial ecosystems for trophic cascades. And more recently, Jim Estes, a marine biologist, led a team of scientists who represent all of the ecosystem types on Earth, pointing out that trophic cascades occur everywhere. And about the same time, Estes and Terborg released a book chronicling the cases. Current research on trophic cascades seems to be focusing on the idea that we live in a much more predator-poor world than we lived in even a century or 2 centuries ago. And so we live in a time of declining abundance of top predators. Some top predators are prized as food, others are persecuted because they are threats to livestock or to us, and this raises the question, what were ecosystems like before the decline of top predators? And given that our modern ecosystem knowledge is obtained in predator-poor ecosystems, to what extent can we claim to really be understanding the past, the foundational ecosystems that in many cases we're trying to restore or use as benchmarks for policy? And I believe this is one of the most fundamental ecological questions that involve trophic cascades right now, and the way to do it is to compare ecosystems that have native predator assemblages, or when possible ancestral predator assemblages, with those that do not. I will close with that. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, and I'm deeply grateful for this award.